A few days ago, FIMA, the swimming world's governing body, announced that it would no longer allow biologically born men to compete in women's sports unless they transition before the age of 12 or before puberty. I tweeted that this is a huge win for science and for common sense. I also said this could be problematic in encouraging more prepubescent children to transition before they fully have the cognitive ability to understand the long-term implications of these decisions. This led to a Twitter exchange which made the claim that I was ignoring all the medical consensus and that I was ultimately a fascist. So as someone that doesn't mind conflict and conversation, I thought, wouldn't it be appropriate and fun and maybe fruitful to invite this person on my channel to unpack these ideas face to face so that nothing was lost in translation. So today I'll be sitting down with Joshua Luckett, co-host of the podcast The Moral Minority, self-professed Christian, and someone that believes that children under the age of 12 should be able to make medical decisions about their gender identity.
Ruslan.
Leah Thompson, they came out, said nope, no more biologically born men transitioning to women competing in women's sports. I said that was a massive win for science and common sense, with the caveat that it might encourage children to want to transition earlier. You say no, you say it's not a win for science and common sense. You think, let's just start with the first part. You think men, biologically born men who transition to be women should compete in female sports. You think that's fair?
I do, and I think that's fair for just a couple of basic reasons. So one, we have such a small percentage of people who do that I don't think it actually affects sports. And I think you would maybe even agree with me that that maybe this is kind of a culture issue that kind of gets thrown out there at times to pull us away from having conversations about bigger systemic issues, particularly economic issues. And, you know, this situation kind of gets thrown out there as kind of red meat of to get people fired up. When truth be told, I mean, you look across the country, whether it's in super amateur athletics with middle school and high school, or even as you move up, this really just doesn't, there's just not enough trans people for this to be a massive issue or a massive hindrance to any sports league. And so that's one where it's I don't think it's enough of an issue, and we could talk more about the nuances of why I think that. But then also so let me start with, I don't have a super huge problem with the ruling, even though I don't agree with it, because I do think that, you know, puberty does give kind of an advantage to masculinity, right? And so I think there's enough of an advantage to masculinity in puberty to where it could be a mild advantage for, trans women who participate in these sports, but not nearly enough for us to make this big of a ruling, because kind of sports by its nature, you're just going to have people who are who have a genetic advantage. And I made the example on Twitter of LeBron James. I know that felt tongue in cheek. But it was more of just kind of an anecdotal of look, you're just going to have people who are in any sports arena pretty freakishly athletic. And I think having this super small percentage of a few trans women who went through a male puberty that may have a slight advantage in a sport, I just don't know if that's worth making this kind of international ruling.
Okay, so I appreciate you acknowledging that biologically born men have an advantage against women in women's sports. Have you seen the soccer team, the professional soccer team competing, a women's soccer team competing against a boys' high school soccer team? Can you guess who won?
I hear you.
The high school boys demolished a women's professional soccer team. I think it's beyond fair to say that men don't just have a slight advantage, they have a huge advantage. If we were to take the best women from the WNBA and put them up against the best men in the NBA, I don't even think it would be close. I don't even think it would be a comparison, that there is such a huge advantage in any world record. I got a friend, Zuby, who in a joking fashion identified as a woman for a day and broke the woman's deadlifting record casually, just in the gym goofing around and broke the women's deadlifting record. Okay, so I think you're minimizing how big of an advantage men have and how the different the bodies are, how all this stuff is. And if there wasn't an advantage, why do we even have male to female sports? That's kind of my pushback to Twitter. Let's let the WNBA girls hoop it up against LeBron. I think we would know exactly where that would go. Furthermore, I dug into Leah Thomas and her testosterone level. She had to be, average male lives at about 700 testosterone if you're healthy. If you've ever met anyone that's below like 400, 300, wildly depressed, like sad, not themselves. And this is why men in their late 40s start taking TRT or testosterone replacement therapy, because your testosterone dips. And these are people I personally know, like a couple I personally know, on the verge of getting divorced. Man starts taking testosterone, gets it back up to a healthy level. And the quote was, and I quote this verbatim, it felt like I got my husband back. That's how much taking testosterone from 300 to 700 went. My testosterone was about an 800. Anything above 1,000 as a man, you're probably toying with something. You can get to like 1,100 naturally, but you're probably injecting something. So that's natural men status. Now, for a woman, the average testosterone for a woman is between 60 and 70. Okay, 60 and 70. Leah Thomas had to get her testosterone under 160. So even at the high end of the peak of the spectrum, she's still substantially at least double that of an average woman's testosterone. And that was the requirement she had to meet. So not to mention that she had gone through puberty, not to mention that her body is different. She's head and shoulders above every other woman there, which gives an advantage in swimming. But her natural testosterone, not her natural testosterone, her augmented testosterone is double that of an average woman, and which led to actual teammates not getting to compete, not getting scholarships, and it negatively impacting the other women that were on her sports team, that were at that meet, that didn't get to place, that had a radical ramifications for multiple women involved because one biologically born man decided to go compete who was ranked 480th in the men's category and all of a sudden is ranked number 1 in the women's category. I don't know how we could look at that objectively and say, yeah, that's fair. Like that's not fair. That's not equal playing field. That's a totally unfair advantage that negatively affects women that we don't like to talk about because women are getting negatively affected by this. On top of which, yes, that you're right. It's a small minority, but it doesn't mean it won't increase. Like it will likely increase, whether that's in the MMA field where you had the girl, the man who transitioned to a woman completely just annihilating and cracking skulls, right? That this is going to become more frequent. And I think an objective concern is saying, hey, this is dangerous to women. This is dangerous to the opportunity of women in the meritocracy of sports, which is probably, we could talk about systemic issues later, but like one of the few meritocracies we have left. And on top, and this is a opportunity cost of like not allowing the 18th woman, 19th woman to compete against other biologically born women. Like, I don't know how we measure this. It's not just a slight advantage. I mean, this is a massive, massive, massive advantage in every measurable metrics, which I think that's why people were like, dude, this is a huge win for women's sports. Forget the trans debate. Like, for women's sports, this is a massive win.
I think one thing we have to consider is trans women live in our society, right?
Sure.
So they do, and I think they legitimately transition, and I think gender dysphoria is a very real thing, and I think people transitioning their gender is a very healthy thing based off of a lot of scientific data, and a good thing. And I think they live in our society. And so if let's say we were to have a sport where only trans women compete against trans women, okay, we wouldn't have the sport. There's just not enough of them for them to compete against one another at all the different levels of sports, right? And so we would have to tell them, okay, because you had gender dysphoria and because you changed your gender, you now cannot compete in sports. And I think that is
no,
that really
you can compete in sports. You can just compete against biologically born men. You can compete against them.
Right, but you do realize that Well, it's a very awkward thing because while I don't know if I agree that it's as that the competitive advantage is that much for trans women across the board. I think there are exceptions, but across the board, like you mentioned earlier, it's still going to very much affect trans women if they play against other cis men. Like that, I mean, they're going to have a
Yeah, but those
significant
folks, yeah,
disadvantage.
but those folks aren't breaking records. You don't see you don't see a biologically born woman transitioning to a man and then smashing the deadlifting record or smashing the
No, no,
swimming
no.
record or knocking out dudes. Like that's not going to happen.
I'm sorry. Maybe I Right. I'm sorry. Maybe I miscommunicated. I'm saying trans women, where do we put them? If they
Mhm.
cannot compete against other women, which I would say societally we should consider them as women. If they cannot compete against other women, well, they certainly can't go compete against cis men with the amount of estrogen and surgery and how much their body's changing into a woman. And so where would they play sports is one thing that I have a concern about. And I don't know if it's enough of them taking over women's sports to whatever degree that they are, which I think is pretty uh, fractional, for us to make these kind of broad, sweeping, comprehensive rulings. And then the other thing is, you mentioned like this is only going to increase. Well, for a minute, for a small minute, right? So, whenever we didn't allow left handed people, whenever society didn't accommodate to left handed people, um, we had less left-handed people. Like crazy enough, we had less left-handed people. Society began to accommodate to left-handed people. This is like 100 years ago or so, and we kind of had a boom for a little bit of left-handed people, and then um, it plateaued out and came down to like a pretty normative level of this being kind of a.
Okay, so
Hopefully that comes in cleaner. Where did I leave off?
so you left off about the left-handed, right-handed illustration, which I've heard before. I think the problematic part about the left-handed, right-handed illustration is that, well, first, let me just back into saying this. I think people should be treated with dignity. I think we should treat people as image bearers of God. I think we should extend compassion to people regardless on whatever choices they make or whatever it is they self-identify as. So I think we have to start there and say, look, we need to treat people with dignity regardless on their background. Now, with regards to the left-handed, right-handed situation, I think the difference here specifically is that if becoming a more inclusive left-handed society, we're now intentionally or unintentionally hurting right-handed people, I think we would say that's not a good idea, meaning that there are women who are being negatively impacted in the physical, in the MMA, girls having their skulls cracked, and within these swim meets that lost opportunity and lost scholarships because this person transitioned and went from being ranked 458th to being ranked number one. There's an actual negative net outcome to women. So if we're saying how do we choose the lesser of two evils? Yes, I want everyone to feel comfortable, accepted, not be bullied, so on and so forth. But if we have to choose the lesser of two evil between, hey, this is going to negatively impact biologically born women, or this is negatively going to impact trans women who have an advantage, who are taller, stronger, bigger, I'm going to say, let's take the lesser of two evil and let it impact negatively trans women than biologically born women. I think that's beyond a reasonable thought process to this that doesn't, position anybody as a villain. It just says, hey, if you got to choose the lesser of two evil, I much rather let it negatively impact trans women because they do have an unfair advantage.
Well, so remember, I don't have as much of an issue with that ruling. I don't agree with the ruling, the FINA ruling, but I don't have the biggest issue with that ruling. I think my biggest issue is, the trans community has kind of been under attack recently by a significant amount of politicians, by a lot of the cultural dialogue around them as groomers and people who could potentially assault people in locker rooms and things of that nature. And I do think that a lot of the dialogue around this sports conversation is tremendously negatively affecting trans women. And I just don't, especially, okay, so how about this? what if these sports leagues, in their independent way, could make healthy rulings on how long you've been transitioning, like like ensuring that someone's been transitioning long enough in order for them to be at some kind of a competitive level. I mean, FINA seems to have done a decent job of looking into it by saying, hey, you going through a puberty gives you a little bit too much of an advantage. I don't love the ruling, but I think it's at least a little bit more um, kind of an intelligent and less reactionary approach. And I'm just like, why not allow these like small sports leagues to kind of make decisions instead of what I'm worried about, less with the FINA ruling, but more with just like we're starting to have like sweeping legislation about like all high school sports or middle school sports in a state.
Mhm.
When we have like three or four trans people participating in high school sports in like the whole state.
Mhm.
And I'm like, so it is kind of negatively affecting not only trans women in these particular sports, but sometimes negatively affecting like the entire culture and potential danger of the stigma around them transitioning, because all of a sudden we become, I think, so I'll say this before I make this statement. You sound like you're being very sincere about your worry about women being hurt or losing opportunities in women's sports. A lot of people all of a sudden care about women's sports to negatively affect and target trans people. And I think that's kind of an issue. And
Yeah,
I
I
don't
mean,
mean, you know,
yeah, I hear you. I just don't know if we're having a good faith conversation. I don't know what, I can't speak to people's motives and if they're being anti-trans or pro-woman. Like I don't know which is, I'm having good faith conversations assuming that people mean well. So I can't call why are people all of a sudden concerned. I do think it doesn't, I do think that's an irrelevant point to whether or not this is helpful and flourishing to women and these folks who have an advantage. But I want to come back to something you said, where you said that you think that it's good for folks to transition. Now, I think it's good for people not to feel bullied. I think it's good for people not to be abused. I think it's good for people not to be ostracized for whatever reason, faith, politics, orientation. I think we need to treat everyone with dignity and respect. But as I was doing the research and I kept digging away at the long-term studies, I wanted to present these to you and see what you thought about them. There's a couple studies here, and I don't know if you could read it here, but the longest study done on the folks who have transitioned, right? The follow-up of post-operative folks that have transitioned by the Birmingham University said the Aggressive Research Intelligence faculty, which conducts review of healthcare treatments for the National Health Service, concludes that none of these studies provides conclusive evidence that gender reassignment is beneficial for patients. It found that most research was poorly designed, which skewed the results in favor of physically changing sex. There was no evaluation of whether other treatments, such as long-term counseling, might help transsexuals or whether their gender confusion might lessen over time. There's a huge uncertainty over whether changing someone's sex is good or a bad thing. Chris Hyde, the director of the facility, said, even if doctors are careful to perform these procedures only on appropriate patients, Hyde continued, there is still a large number of people who have the surgery but remain traumatized, often to the point of self-deletion. So this is the longest study done in Sweden, which is one of the most gender, affirming LGBTQ pro countries out there. And again, in 2014, a new review of the scientific literature was done by Hayes Inc., a research and consulting firm that evaluates the safety and health outcomes of medical technologies. Hayes found that evidence on long-term results of sex reassignment was too sparse to support meaningful conclusion and gave these studies its lowest rating for quality. Statistically significant improvements have not been consistently demonstrated by multiple studies for most outcomes. Evidence regarding quality of life and function in male to female adults was very sparse. Evidence for less comprehensive measures of well-being in adult recipients of cross-sex hormone therapy was directly applicable to gender dysmorphic patients, but was sparse and or conflicting. The study's design do not permit conclusions of casualty, and studies generally had weaknesses associated with study execution as well. There are potentially long-term safety risks associated with with hormone therapy, but none have been proven or conclusively ruled out. So the longest studies that we found, and I'll tell you how this practically impacts us here in America in a second, and it might shock you. There is no conclusive proof that these things long-term are beneficial to the folks that are going for the transition, that in a very inclusive and supportive society 10, 20 years down the road, nothing really changes with the mental health of these individuals. Nothing improves on a macro scale that we can say this is good and beneficial for human flourishing. Outside of the let's not bully people, let's not attack people, let's not otherize people, there's not a lot of evidence to suggest that this is a good thing for society.
Well, to say there's not a lot of evidence is a bit of a stretch. I cannot deny that those are very valid studies. I mean, they clearly are, decently comprehensive. But we also have a significant amount of research and consensus science here in the States, particularly when it comes to, fair to say, the immediate effects of people who are going through gender dysphoria in particular, not gender discomfort, and we can make that distinction later if we need to, but specifically gender dysphoria, that it is a very healthy thing if they feel like their gender dysphoria is extreme enough to actually have a transition. And so we definitely know that it has significantly decreased self-deletion and fatalities amongst people who
in the
have
short
gotten those
term,
surgeries.
in the short term, folks who have gotten a more supportive community, folks who feel more accepted, folks who feel like they go down a process. In the short term, it does seem what you're suggesting is that some of the studies show that they do feel better in the short term with regards to some of the mental health issues in the community.
And that's fair enough. And that's an interesting study, but it would seem as though, at the very least, from what we know in the short term, it is saving children from self-harm and self-deletion, and saving adults from
Yeah.
self-harm and
So,
self-deletion.
so I think there's a wide spectrum of how you can support people in whatever gender dysmorphia or whatever it is that they're going through. I think the issue becomes when we start prescribing experimental treatment for children that can't provide consent to having sexual relationships, right? We've ruled that. That's a thing, right? A lot of these kids are going through phases. I have a 7-year-old. I'm not sure. Do you have children?
I do not.
Yeah, so I have a
I
7-year-old.
work with kids, in fairness.
Okay, you do work with kids. Okay, and
Yeah.
so I think there's a lot of, I think, problematic things with regards to children just not having a grasp on reality. And before we go on to that, I want to actually play for you. So there was a case in the UK where one of the main clinics got sued for ascribing these sorts of things, and then they pressed them. This is secular news. This isn't Christian. This isn't conservative. Pressed them on what's in some of these puberty blockers. So I want to play this for you.
Blockers, you will know that those who criticize the use of them in young people say this is experimental treatment that can have lifelong consequences. You're using a drug which is most commonly used to, or licensed to, treat advanced prostate cancer in men and to chemically castrate male sex offenders and to halt very early puberty. It is not licensed to treat gender dysphoria in children. That is true, isn't it?
So the stuff that they're using, right, and I can play you the rest of the clip, to actually do these transitions aren't even, this is used to castrate men and to treat totally other illnesses. Like this, so this is an experimental procedure that now we're, in terms of the puberty blocker stuff, that now we're prescribing to kids as, young as 10, 11 years old. It's hard for me to wrap my brain around how that is good or beneficial when these consequences oftentimes are irreversible. Like the damage to some of this stuff is irreversible. Folks can't have orgasms when they grow up, right? Like they're not able to be fertile later down the road. And so these are permanent decisions that kids that we say you can't drive and you aren't of the age to give consent to sex are allowed to make. I think we're entering some very dangerous territory here.
Well, let's a couple different things there. So one, to start with, I don't. Kids are not making these decisions autonomously, right?
Okay.
So this is actually a pretty lengthy process where a child comes to their parent probably somewhere in between the ages of 7 and 12 or 11 or something along those lines,
Mhm.
and says, "Hey, I'm." They at least on the surface show gender discomfort, and their parent then sends them to a psychiatrist, to a counselor, to a therapist. And this is years of doctor prescribed counseling, therapy. And then, like, you mentioned the hormone blockers. We also have a significant amount of evidence to show that they simply delay puberty until late teenage stage or early adolescence, and then puberty takes off from there. There's a significant amount of data to show that that is also what's taking place. But to the point of the 11-year-old, I get that yes, they normally don't consent to a lot of other things in their life as far as like lifelong decision making, right? But they are not making this decision by this is not them waking up, rolling out of the bed, and saying, "Hey, mom, I think I need to have this, like extreme surgery." This is a pretty collective group of people and experts walking a child through years of this conversation before there's actually a sex change or a significant surgery. And so that's one thing that I think is
Yeah,
important.
I don't know, Joshua, in terms of how exhaustive it is, because I know here in California, there's a mother suing a school district where two teachers were put on leave because of ushering in, or I don't want to say the grooming word because I don't know if that's always fair, but they were put on administrative leave because they had a fifth, sixth grader start using other pronouns and identifying as the opposite sex. And then the mother got involved. They called CPS on the mother. And this wasn't a long, exhaustive process where the parents were involved. These were teachers who were putting them in a like equality LGBTQ club, and a fifth grader who then transitions or seemingly starts wanting to use different pronouns is pulled out of that environment, and within months goes back to their original orientation. And this is a lawsuit that's happening right now in California. These teachers are on administrative leave. There's also documentation. I'll show you two cases of other folks that aren't. This isn't. Again, I'm not going through this process, so I don't know if we're talking years, months, whatever. But there's enough to suggest that it's not as quick as we may think it is. So let me show you this case. I don't know if you've heard of Kyra Bell. This is who put the whole thing kind of on notice. And I don't know about you, I see a lot of folks coming out and detransitioning now. They say there's approximately 5,000 folks in the UK, because again, Europe was early on this, that are looking to detransition based on the raw numbers. So I'm gonna show you Kyra Bell, and I'm gonna show you another case, and I would like to hear your reaction to it.
The whole process is really traumatic, really, when I'm looking back on it, and there's no going back from it, really, because you are changed forever, visibly. I think I was about 4 or 5 here. That was like only a year or so into transition. There was no real investigation into the other mental health issues that I was going through, or any other factors that could possibly be contributing to the feelings that I had at the time. I think depression kind of kicked in a bit more because I was without any hormones in my body, and especially at such a young age when it's supposed to be at its peak almost. That's very detrimental, I think.
It's actually pretty ironic because at the time I had these beliefs where it's like, oh, we live in such a transphobic society, it's going to be so hard to get testosterone. But once I actually went through it, it was incredibly easy. I just made an appointment at a Planned Parenthood, and on my medical records, it says I have a diagnosis of an endocrine disorder, and that's why I needed the testosterone. So when I sat down with that nurse practitioner and she began to kind of talk to me about, I think that I have extra estrogen because my hips are big. So I think I need more testosterone. And she didn't push back against that at all. She pretty much just agreed and said like, okay, well, where would you like to start? And then I said like, how high can we go? And she suggested, a much higher dosage. And so I actually ended up starting at 100.
So here are two different cases. Kyra Bell was younger. She was 16. This other girl, both of them, Kyra Bell is saying she has irreversible stuff to her body, took this to court, won a ruling in the UK that they cannot use puberty blockers on folks under 16. And so that she felt like she didn't get the right support and care. And there's been other folks coming out. And then the ruling actually just recently got overturned. And then I showed you a different girl who had a similar situation, walked in same day, was able to get testosterone injected in her, same day. So I don't know where the spectrum is of how exhaustive these screenings are and how long of a process this takes versus calling somebody by gender, different pronouns, versus like, now you're talking about somebody that like, they may not be able to ever have children again. They may not be able to have an orgasm again because of these experimental drugs, and prescribing that they should be took, 11, 12-year-olds, man. I don't know. I think this is really, really wonky, and I understand the heart. Like, we want these folks to feel accepted, and we want these folks to feel like they are not being bullied. But I mean, even the one of the leading psychiatrists on this recently, she came out and said that she feels that this has come to believe that some children, this is a trans woman psychiatrist, came out and said has come to believe that some children identifying as trans are falling under the influence of their peers in social media, right? The social media spike with folks self-identifying as a part of the LGBTQIA community. You have, Gen X, 4%, millennials, 10%, Gen Z is at 20%, self-identifying 20%. 1 out of 5 Gen Zers are identifying this. So I think it would be naive for us to say that the outside world and society, teachers, all of these different things we're seeing on TikTok, which, by the way, China, who owns TikToks, their TikTok is completely different than American TikTok, yet they could access all the data. I think it's very, naive for us to say that the outside society doesn't impact how children view their orientation, which could lead them, and again, I'm not saying in every situation, but could lead them to make choices to their body with their parents and these advocates to make stuff that may not be reversible. They may not be able to have kids down the road. They may not be able to come out of this. So I don't know how you process all of that. We're talking about every generation has doubled in self-identification as LGBTQIA, and where's that going to take us eventually, right? Like if according to the charts, like, fam, we just keep doubling as a civilization. Like, these things are getting in a really murky area. So again, I think what we're saying is it fruitful and is it flourishing to inject experimental drugs on kids that cannot vote, they cannot drive, they cannot give sexual consent? And you're saying yes because a parent and a psychiatrist is involved, and it may take some time. That's kind of the, and then everybody that disagrees, I mean, hopefully you don't hold this position, but everybody who disagrees and says, nah, this is kind of wonky, there's some studies that show opposite, is a bigot or is potentially leaning to fascist ideology. Like, it's hard for me to grasp my brain around the apologetic for this being good for children flourishing.
Yeah, a couple thoughts. I mean, like, I want to be clear that, like, a lot of times we will go for like the lowest age possible and be like, oh, there's like 5-year-olds transitioning, and you didn't do that. This is more kind of what kind of comes across in a lot of these conversations. And it's like if we're honest, this is probably someone in their early preteens having this conversation with their parents, probably been having this conversation with their parents for years. Once again, there are medical experts that are stepping in. There's medical psychiatrists that are stepping in. So we do need to consider that there is a lot of expertise around this child and this decision. But, interestingly enough, if we were to bring this to like a religious conversation, like, we look to children to make pretty significant decisions quite frequently. Evangelicals will ask, 6, 7, 9-year-old students or children to make eternal decisions about their eternal destiny, about whether they're going to heaven or hell, and explain those realities pretty bluntly in order to be persuasive to that child.
Do you think that's a bit of a generality though? Because I have a 7-year-old, man, and you know what I'm trying to do, brother, is I'm trying to push him out from getting baptized. I want him to really understand, and that's something we've been praying about a lot. He's taking a baptism course. He's seeking wisdom on it. We pray about it often because I want him to understand the proclamation he's making is a big deal. So I don't know how accurate that is. Maybe in certain circles, but me, my friend Artur from Apologia Center, like a lot of folks we know that have kids the same age, it's more so like, hey, this is a big decision. Let's make sure that you know what you're doing, and we don't have to get you baptized 4 times, like Kanye says. Right? I've been baptized these 3 or 4 times, right? I won't get you baptized once, right? And so, do you think that you may be using a bit of a generality? Because I believe in an age of accountability. Like I believe that spiritually, kids aren't all there. And if we and I'll go further. If there's mental illness on top of that, if there's other issues on top of developmental issues on top of that, I don't know where someone's barometer of measuring long-term consequences. I mean, bro, I grew up in Southeast San Diego, peak of rap music, gangster rap music in the 90s, and I got sucked into all kinds of debauchery. I got arrested at age 11, breaking into houses, and I'm not gonna say it was just the music, but it was the environment, it was my friends, it was the music, it was happening in my neighborhood, and all of these things had me on a very, very reckless trajectory that, man, I'm so glad that my mother moved me out of that neighborhood and we moved a little further away from the city, and I was able to get access to some other people and some other information. That's the part where I go, man, I hear you, like medical consensus, all these different things, and we talked about that, but it's like medical consensus have been wrong before, brother. Like we was doing frontal lobotomies on Kennedys in the 1960s. Like that wasn't that long ago where folks was, you know, they had bipolar and the medical consensus with a doctor and a psychiatrist and a family member. I'm sure you're familiar with the story of one of the Kennedy daughters, right? And it did a lobotomy on her and it did her in, right? We talked about eugenics and racism in, you know, the medical field and viewing black people as inferior. Like the medical consensus has been wrong. So my fear is, are we going to look back at this 50 years from now, 100 years from now, and go, what did we do? What did we allow these kids to do to themselves? Maybe some of these kids would have turned out to be gay. Maybe some of these kids would have turned out to just be tomboys. Where are all the tomboys at? Like, I grew up with a bunch of tomboys, and they all went on to get married and have babies and be wives, right? It was a phase, if you will. Now I feel like these kids that are tomboys, and I'm saying are, but can be pushed into believing this when they turn on TikTok, and that's what's being pushed in the algorithm. When they hear the stuff coming out of the White House, when they listen to their teachers, we have to be honest and say, these things do influence children. Like they do influence children. It's not just nature. Well, they're all just born this way and we don't have any influence into their orientation, into their sexual identity. All of these things play a factor, and they played a factor into me as someone that was molested as a kid, that grew up confused, sexually like promiscuous. Like these things impacted me in like massive ways. And again, what I'm not going to do is say everybody's grooming and the public school system is like, I'm not going to jump out the window and say that sort of stuff. But there's a lot of cases here, man, again, of a lot of these, you know, I feel like I stumble across someone almost weekly that's detransitioning, and they get little support. They get little support, and they get completely dragged. And I'm not even talking like religious detransitioning, folks who get saved, and like, I'm talking just folks that are like, I was led astray. Right, and this girl Kyra Bell is getting dragged all over anytime you search her name. You know, so like, where is the embracement of their stories and acknowledge them as like, fam, like these people were led astray by our society in a lot of ways, especially in Europe, which again I think has been more progressive in many regards on this.
Well, yeah, and I mean, I guess the point I was making was, you know, as I've been a ordained minister for 10 years and have worked with children. And a lot of ministers across the board are very cautious about being careful not to just have a checklist of like, well, we got, 70 kids saved at VBS and we're good, and like really investigating like the child's decision and having a consensus conversation about it. But I am saying that like we do look to children to make pretty big decisions about, we're letting children decide at like 11, 12 years old whether they're going to start seriously getting into football, and look at the long-term physical effects that has on their body, even if they just played through high school. And
I'll be honest with you. I'm gonna be completely honest with you. my son's not playing football. He's not making that decision at 11 or 12 years old. My son's trying to convince me to get a skateboard. And we're like, you're gonna have to show me that you're safe. So I maybe some people, but I don't know. I don't know. I guess I just don't know.
Pretty general.
We drive our kids everywhere. Like I'm sure me and you grew up going outside. Right, like going to the corner store, right? I think we don't trust these kids to do a lot of stuff, but making these sorts of decisions, I can't help but feel like some of this might be like this weird virtue signal of like, yay, I have a trans kid and I'm on the progressive side versus like, wait a minute, like we don't trust them to choose their own meals. We don't trust them to do all kinds of stuff, right? And to make these sorts of decisions, like, I don't know, man.
These are big decisions, and I think there's just a couple things to consider, right? I mean, like you definitely have a situation where a couple of things to what you said. So there is a difference between gender discomfort and gender dysphoria.
Sure.
Right. So gender discomfort, me and you, I think everyone's kind of just experienced gender discomfort before, where you're just like, hey, some of the rules that were created for my gender as a cis male, I'm not really for. And I got to navigate what it looks like for me to live out maleness.
Can you give me an example of something specific, like something you're uncomfortable with as a cisgender man?
Well, I'll stick away from me, and let's just use the example of like the common woman. So like the cosmopolitan woman is, what it looks like for them to be a woman is like, I don't know, catty, like selfish, a big shopaholic, like, very flashy, whatever. Whereas like the rural, like Southern woman is like nurturing and a homestead and a faithful wife and all of that. And then you have like the Boston, like educated, like Ivy League woman who's like a boss woman and like, and like always was successful in scholastics and everything like that. And a woman's and all of those are pretty like stereotypical understandings of what a woman is, even depending on geographics. And so a woman has to, a young girl is going to think through, okay, what does it look like for me to be a woman? Like, how do I fit into any of the gender kind of cultural spheres of what it looks like to be a woman? That's natural gender discomfort. Every parent has to navigate with their child through that. And sometimes what parents realize is, maybe my child isn't just experiencing pretty normative gender discomfort. Maybe my child's actually experiencing a more extreme version of actual gender dysphoria. And they don't find that out simply in conversation with their child. They're finding that out with their child and a lot of medical expertise joining them in that conversation.
Do you think that there are certain things about gender, about masculinity that are more related to natural law? I'm not sure if you're familiar with the concept. It's coined by St. Thomas Aquinas, natural law, meaning that, and I would say that they're aligned with what we see in society, meaning this. They've done studies and they've measured the net take-home income of two-income household where both the wife and husband work versus one-income household. And the overall trajectory is that single-income households take home more money and tend to be more happy and satisfied when they do that, when there's one bread provider, one breadwinner versus two, because when you factor in all the other things like dry cleaning, like driving, like gas, like eating out, you're taking home less money. You're paying oftentimes $1,500 a month for daycare per child, and it doesn't really create a net positive. I'll give you another example. They did a study with women. And I could provide the source of this. This is not a conservative study. This is like a cosmopolitan woman study. They did a study and they found out that over 56% of women who have children under the age of 18 would have preferred to stay home and raise their kids instead of work. So they surveyed working women with children under the age of 18, and they found out that the vast majority of them, over 56%, would have preferred the option to stay home if it was presented to them, right? So I think I hear you on some of the, like we get into like toxic masculinity and whatever that means, and right, and some of the other stuff. But I think that there are certain things that generally we're wired in a way where my wife is just going to be more nurturing than I am. And I'm going to be a bit more aligned with a structured discipline and be able to connect with my kids more physically, and we might roughhouse around. Don't you think that there are certain things that are just natural law that we have designed for us with regards to how we function as people? And I'm not saying there aren't exceptions to the rule. I'm saying it seems like we take the exceptions to the rule, and now we say, here's the exception to the rule. This child is dealing with gender dysphoria. So now we have to teach it to everyone that it's ideal. And I think that's where conservatives, where I would align with conservatives, push back and go, wait a minute, listen, I have no problem with you doing you. I have a problem when you start telling me that what you do, we all need to celebrate and affirm and say this is ideal, and it's not, because for civilization, as long as we can go back and in a very measured way where we can say, hey, these things, it's how these work out. Most women would prefer to stay home and raise kids, right? Most men like to be providers. Are there exceptions to the rules? Sure. But I think we're trying to make the exception to the rule the standard. And I think it's costing us. I think it's creating a detriment, with life expectancy going down, with mental illness on the rise, with self-deletion on the rise. And again, I'm not saying like America is this Christian nation that has, like, that's not what I'm saying at all. I'm just saying transculturally, there are certain universal laws and natural laws and order that I believe in a creator, in a capital God, Jesus, creator, that has set the world in motion. And I think we keep trying to make exceptions to the rule and overcorrecting and saying, no, this is we now, it's not just, hey, leave people alone and let them be them, and don't bully people and don't be a schmuck and a jerk for people that are different. But now, I have to affirm it, and I have to have my child taught this gender ideology in, 4th grade, 5th grade. Like, help me understand, because I don't understand how any of that makes sense. I know I just threw a lot at you, so I apologize for, you know what I'm saying? Like, I'm just processing. So forgive me for throwing so many different things at you, but go ahead.
We're good. Just know I'm enjoying the conversation. I mean, like, I think, one, feminism, particularly as it has evolved, is very inclusive in the idea of it celebrates the idea of women either staying at home or stepping into higher education and other forms of the work field.
You think that's true? I don't know if I agree. You think that's true? You think most modern women celebrate the stay-at-home mom and go, "You go, girl, you stay home and raise your kids"? You think stay-at-home moms are equally celebrated and championed in our society?
Well, I think the idea of feminism is that you have the choice to choose either.
The idea, but how is it fleshed out with the modern feminism, where you can have a hot girl summer and do whatever you want with your body, but then, but don't you tell me that I can't, I got to use protection, right? Like, is that actually, isn't that what we call that toxic feminism then? Like, you know what I mean? Like, what is that?
No, yeah, I think you're always going to have people who are, who overemphasize or extreme. But the point was, America rigidly restricted women to the home, and feminism, particularly as it has evolved into different waves, came along and said, no, women should have the choice to step out of the home. To a couple of your points, one, I think that we have to consider that society has a large, like you talked about earlier, how much society has an impact on potentially children making the decision about whether they want to be a particular gender or not, or how they view their sexuality. Well, also society has a tremendous amount of effect on how people view what it looks like to be a woman or a man. If this stuff was so intrinsic to our sex, then Christians wouldn't have massive conferences about like womanhood and manhood, particularly more traditional Christian expressions. And so I do think that there is just a sense in which, like, society, there is a lot of influence that communicates to women, hey, it's kind of good to be home and take care of your kid, and that could be ideal. But also, I mean, we're obviously seeing society push in a way where we're saying, no, we believe that what it means to be a woman is pretty multifaceted, and that there's some women who can enjoy, especially if they have a husband who makes a significant amount of money, enjoy being at home, being a homestead, taking care of the home, flourishing that space, raising their children. And then there's also a significant amount of women who would love to pursue careers, pursue vocations, and step into higher scholastic um, spaces. And I will say also, like, we do have to consider that, so that was kind of my pushback on the natural law thing, is I think a lot of that's just influenced by society. In Jesus's time, in a
Can
pretty
you unpack that for me a bit more? Like what when you say a man being a provider, protector, and priest of his home is influenced by society, and I would say I think that's kind of ancient wisdom. Help me understand how you think that's, because I think a society impacts it for the negative, not for how we're naturally designed to function. And as we enter manhood, we go and we hunt and we kill something, we drag it home, we provide for the tribe, we provide for our family, right? Like, help me understand how you think that's an outside versus an inside expression of natural law.
Absolutely. Ancient Mesopotamian society, like ancient Near East Mesopotamian society and first century Palestinian society, it's actually a pretty efficient economic model to have men go out, work, gather, hunt, create, and to have women be, procreators, nurturers. It was actually a pretty efficient model during that time period. And even kind of the rigid ways that we understand, potentially rigid ways that we understand marriage and procreation made a lot of sense within, like, protecting, like, land rights and keeping land in particular family units for perpetual time periods and things of that nature. So it was a pretty efficient model in the ancient Mesopotamian
100%.
time. It may not be the most efficient model, particularly in a democratic society where you're saying, hey, like, we have choices now. We can be economically efficient in a variety of ways. And so this is anecdotal, but I know a significant amount of women who would love to be mothers and would love to be married, but also want to chase down and pursue um, different aspects in certain fields, scholastically, academically, or even just experiences, travel, and kind of a more free form lifestyle. And so I think what's natural in many ways, just kind of what we call natural now, in many ways was just kind of a really efficient model for an ancient society. And there's still aspects of it that are good in our world, but we can be economically efficient in a variety of ways. And I think that gives a lot of room for people to have very different expressions of how they decide to live out masculinity or femininity.
So I want to address the economically efficient, but I just want to make sure we're on the same page. And this is poised by my buddy Zach, who's in a chat. So just so are we on the same page? So gender norms can be influenced by society, but are you saying gender identity and sexual orientation can't be influenced by society, or are you saying both can be influenced by society? Because I want to make sure we're on the same page.
100% both can be influenced by society.
Okay.
And
So
I
when
think
we-
that's ultimately just real super briefly, because
Yes.
I do want to hear your response. But I think ultimately, yes, like I would say that in a couple of areas. One, in my left-handed example earlier, like if we accommodate more for something that was considered not normative in a society, you're going to see a temporary boom. Okay, so that's one area where that is gonna happen. But also, if we expand our society to a democratic, cosmopolitan society, then it's gonna open the door for people to have different expressions of gender in ways that we've never had those expressions of gender in the past.
Okay, so I showed you this chart earlier. I'm not sure if you've heard the Bill Maher joke, right? Which this chart has the LGBTQIA doubling every generation, and he said, "Well, at this rate, by 2050, everyone's going to be LGBTQIA."
Everyone will be gay, yeah.
Right. And so,
I saw the joke, yeah.
Yeah. So based on that, like, I'm glad that we agree that society does influence how we perceive ourselves, and that does extend to orientation, that does extend to gender, that does extend to these how people self-identify. So I'm glad we agree there, and that it can be outside influence. So you said, phrase that to me again. You said economically beneficial, efficient.
Mm-hmm.
Help me understand that, because here's what I'm seeing in real time. I'm seeing a lot of women go to college because they've been indoctrinated to go to college since they were little girls, get 4-year degrees, sometimes get 8-year degrees, really crush it. And I don't think anybody would say a woman can't crush it in college, right? Mm-hmm. Take out exorbitant amounts of student loan debt, which, as we know, you're never getting rid of that student loan debt. That's never getting written off. That you can't file for bankruptcy and get rid of it. And then entering their 30s and discovering that, oh, I want to be a mother, right? Like, and then entering relationships, whether marriages or whatever, having children with the student loan debt, either going and being moms for a decade or 5 years, or paying someone else, which is what childcare is, to raise their children. Help me understand how that's economically efficient. I don't see that. I think what's economically efficient is, hey, college may not be for everybody. Hey, if you want to be a stay-at-home mom and you feel like your desire is to get married and have babies, like, maybe that's good, and there's nothing wrong with that, right? But how is it economic efficient to project to young women and men, by the way, to take out exorbitant amounts of student loan debt, which is federally insured, which has all kinds of negative ramifications on cost of living and other areas. I live in an area with 3 colleges driving distance: Cal State San Marcos, Palomar College, St. Augustine University. Our cost of living goes through the roof. Why? Because they can raise the prices on the college kids. Why? Because they're playing with monopoly money and it's all student loans. They're not really, you know what I mean? So like, this has real implications for people and displacing people. So how is that economically efficient? I don't understand.
Well, the problem is extreme and not well-regulated capitalism isn't economically efficient for anyone. When you over-commodify a society where it's like we pay for everything and there's nothing that's taken off the table as essentials to live, like childcare should be federally funded, college should be free.
Why?
Well, because we have the right to pursue as much education as possible. That should be a human right.
But why should someone else watch your kids? If you want to have 10 kids, why should childcare be free and education be free, and you could have 10 kids and do whatever, like, right? I'm using a radical example, but like, why should I don't have a problem with creating safety nets, right? I just don't know why college should be free or childcare should be free. Like, why?
Well, I think you can get multiple options, right? So we see the example of Pharaoh's daughter, paying Moses' mother to nurture Moses for a time. And I do think that stay-at-home moms, that should be subsidized. And I also think that daycare and childcare should be subsidized. I believe in a welfare state. So I believe that you're going to have more economic efficiency if you don't overly exhaustively commodify society, and you have things that are taken off the table as, hey, here are things that everyone should have a baseline start with. And it gives a lot of people the opportunity to be innovative, creative, pursue vocations, pursue dreams, pursue passions, really pursue the pursuit of happiness. And so, yeah, I think the reason that you're not getting economic efficiency right now is because we have a kind of unwell-regulated capitalist society that over commodifies everything.
Yeah, and I don't want to go down the rabbit hole of like capitalism versus socialism, but we have that in Sweden now, and the only difference is that everyone pays more taxes, whereas here the bottom 50% pay very little in taxes. So I think if that's what people want here, if everybody's willing to rock out and pay what they pay in Sweden, charge it, bud. But I think what we're seeing here is we're seeing plans like tax the rich and assuming that just wealthy people can float that, while the bottom folks are getting rebates and contributing very little. I mean, if you look at the amount that like the highest in, like, I think the top 1% contribute over 45% to all taxes. Like, that's insane. So I'm not opposed to what you're saying, right? If we say, hey, healthcare is a right, education's a right, all these things right. But I think we have to be sober. I think that here's what I'll say. I think the issue with your argument is that it's been disingenuous in the people that have represented it with packaging and branding like tax the rich, when the folks who just keep it a buck, like Bernie Sanders, and just be like, look, we all gonna pay more in taxes. Like, everybody gonna pay more in taxes, right? But it'll be a net break even, right? Poor people pay more in taxes, rich people, it'll be a net break even. The issue though is that's not what AOC is saying, that's not what these folks are saying, is they're just saying tax the rich, tax the rich. When you actually look at what the rich pay as a whole, and by rich, I just mean, upper middle class. I'm not even talking like, I'm not talking billionaires, right? I'm just, I'm talking like you're making over $100,000 a year, and the amount that's paid from a percentage standpoint, but then also from the gross of what's collected in the taxes. It's a high percentage of people of the total generated and the percentage of taxes coming out. And the folks on the lower end of the spectrum are getting a rebate back from the government. Like, they pay taxes and get a refund at the end of the year, right? So I think, like, I don't think people really would be willing to do that if they knew the cost, where, hey, now everybody's taking a 15% dip in their income, 20% dip. You make 10 grand, boom, we slicing that. Now you make 8, right? So I think that's the part. So again, I would encourage you, and I'm not sure if you've ever looked into it, I would encourage you to look at what Sweden is doing. And they're a very hyper-capitalistic society, with the caveat that they just have more safety nets, that everybody's willing to pay more. And they do pay more. Their average tax rate, I believe, is at like 40%. Like, that's a lot. It's a lot for someone that's making 50K, 40K a year to be like, all right, cool, I'm going to slide the government back 40%. On top of which, I just don't know how much the government is efficient at doing, right? Like, I don't know if I go to the DMV, the post office is like, but I've been on Medi-Cal, I've been on Medicare, I've been on food stamps, I've been on welfare with my mom. I've just never seen the government be very efficiently. So again, I don't want to unpack a whole can of worms of like capitalism versus socialism, but I understand your paradigm with you saying, hey, I believe there should be more safety nets, basically is what you're saying. I should be more safety nets, right? And I say, if we're all willing to pay for it.
Yeah, and like you said, we don't want to get on this caveat too long, but just a couple of responses. I mean, in the 60s, post the, my favorite president, FDR, instituting so much of that welfare state, in the 50s and 60s, man, we had a pretty high tax rate on the rich, and it actually created this like nostalgia that we have for the 50s and 60s, at least as far as creating a middle class. I'm Black. I know the 50s and 60s was a mess, but
I was going to say, he's talking about these. I'm like, wait a minute, this is pre-civil rights, my brother. We're back in 50s and 60s.
Yeah, I know it was a mess.
But there was also other variables, and I don't know how much of the higher tax rate was ever actually paid, right? Like, I don't know if anybody was out here really paying a 90% tax rate. I think they finagled, like wealthy people do, a lot of different things, you know what I'm saying, with taxes. Because I think, when I went and looked at it,
we still had it.
But it wasn't an effective tax rate. Like, not a lot of people were actually paying 90% of their income taxes. And there was also the boom after the World War, World War II. There was a lot of other factors into the 50s and 60s. So let me show you a couple more things with regard. We'll go back to the trans thing, and then you could ask me anything you want to ask me. So here's something that like, based on the studies, here's something that folks don't know about the transition in conversation that blew my mind what I find out. Like, this completely blew my mind. So this is from the Obama administration. In the conclusions they came with regards to funding this sort of stuff, this treatment through Medicare and Medicaid. Now, again, I've been on Medicare. My mother, I think, is on Medicaid right now, right? So they visited this, and what they found out, and this is why they chose not to cover these sorts of procedures, is that this is from the Obama administration, right? Proposed decision memo for gender dysmorphia and gender reassignment. Based on a thorough review of the clinical evidence available at the time, there is not enough evidence to determine whether gender reassignment surgery improves health outcomes for Medicare beneficiaries with gender dysmorphia. There were conflicting, inconsistent study results of the best designed studies. Some reported benefits, while others reported harms. The quality and strength of evidence were low due to the mostly observational studies done with no comparison groups, potential coup funding, and small sample sizes. Many studies that reported positive outcomes were exploratory type studies, case series and case control with no confirmatory follow-up. And then, where's the next slide? And then they go on to say, so this is the final 2016 memo, which is even more blunt. Overall, the quality and strength of evidence were low due to mostly observational study designs with no comparison group, subjective endpoints, potential. So what they're saying is like they did these studies and there was no comparison group with whether or not these were beneficial transitions for people to have. Small sample size, lack of validated assignment tools, etc. The majority of studies were non-longitudinal, I don't know how to say that word, or did not include concurrent controls or testing prior to and after surgery. Several reported positive results, which is kind of what you're getting at, but the potential issues noted above reduced strength and confidence. After careful assessment, we identified 6 studies that could provide useful information. Of these, the 4 best designed and conducted studies that assess the quality of life before and after reassignment surgery using validated, albeit non-specific, psychometric studies did not demonstrate clinically significant changes or differences in psychometric test results after surgery. And then it goes on to say the study identified increased mortality and psychiatric hospitalization compared to the matched controls. The mortality was primarily due to completed self-deletions, 19.1 fold greater than in controlled Swedish. So this is, they're referencing the Swedish study. So 19 times more likely, not because of the reassignment surgery, but despite the reassignment surgery, despite treatment, despite this stuff, still 19 times more likely for self-deletions due to neoplasm, cardiovascular disease was increased 2 to 2.5 times as well. We note mortality from this patient population did not become apparent until after 10 years. So this is 10 years in the future. The risk for psychiatric hospitalization was 2.8 times greater than in controls even after the adjustment for prior psychiatric disease. The risk for attempted self-deletion was greater in male to female patients, but I explained to you why when you lower testosterone and what it does to a male body, regardless of the gender of the control. Furthermore, we cannot exclude therapeutic interventions as a cause of the observed excess morbidity and mortality. This study, however, was not conducted to assess the impact of gender reassignment surgery per se. So everything that they looked at, so the Obama administration and the evidence they looked at led them to the conclusion that we cannot, we're not funding this. Government ain't funding these transitions. We're not paying for it. We're not doing it for Medicare. But you know what I mean? And so, and this is Obama. Like this is, at this point, this is way after he switched his position on gay marriage. Like this is Obama saying, not Obama himself saying, but his administration saying, listen, there's not a lot to say that this is beneficial to the person going through it, and therefore we're not going to fund it. And that the long-term studies, 10 years in the future, they still found out that these folks are 19 times more likely for self-deletion than regular people who don't go through these situations, or just people that don't identify as trans or whatever. It's, again, hard for me to say that this is good or ideal for human flourishing and good or ideal for people, and that we need to push it as healthy and good, right? Versus caveat, exception to the rule. Folks can, make their choices. I tend to take more of a libertarian position on stuff. You do what you do. Leave me and my family alone. Don't tell me what I got to teach my kids. And I'm probably not going to put my kids in public school if we're going to be saying this is good and this is healthy. That's kind of like how I rock, But I would love to hear your response to a study like that.
Yeah, a couple of thoughts. So, earlier you mentioned like kind of a couple of thoughts here. So earlier you mentioned kind of how politicians message and how I could present kind of a more socialist position, and it had a little bit more of a exhaustive and kind of better to the ear messaging than a politician, because they got to use short quips and they got to be pretty strategic in how they message things. I do think what President Obama was doing there, if I'm honest, is I think he was trying to avoid stepping into a culture issue that could hurt him, and saw conflicting studies on something and said, well, it's too conflicting for me to make a move. Whereas I do think that there was a pretty good consensus, and still is a pretty good scientific consensus, that that this is a healthy prescription to gender dysphoria. And I think he found a way to be stagnant on an issue, and that's unfortunate.
So he just was a politician. He did what politicians do there.
Yeah, I think he tucked tail. But earlier, you mentioned like the regret, and I do think that that's a valid thing. I do think that that happens. I mean, you mentioned on Twitter, the 5,000 people in what was it, UK,
In the UK, yeah.
who wanted to detransition, and then you mentioned the two individuals earlier, and I want to be clear about that. That's a real thing. That's a real thing because this is a real big decision that people are making, whether it's at a young age or at a later stage. It's a really big decision. But I do think we need to be careful with overemphasizing the regret because in any big decision, marriage is good, even though a lot of people want to get a divorce. Stepping into the pastorate was good for me, even if a lot of ministers have stepped out during COVID. And so just because there's a significant amount of regret doesn't mean that the decision was inherently unhealthy or not good for flourishing.
Sure. So to bring the conversation full circle, based on everything we just talked about, based on you acknowledging there's conflicting studies, based on you acknowledging that there's folks who are have regretted transitioning, but based on, we don't know how this is going to play out 10, 20, 30 years from now, how many folks are going to want to detransition. Right now, I think the percentage is about 10%. Maybe that'll increase. Maybe I don't know, right? I'm banking on that. I think that it'll increase. I think society is doing their thing to confuse people with regards to this. I think a lot of these folks are tomboys. I think a lot of these folks maybe are struggling with same-sex attraction. That's neither here. That's my theory. But based on the conversation we just had, you and me just had, and you can ask me anything you want, right? But is it fair to say that it is not unreasonable for conservatives to take the positions that we take? That it's not done out of bigotry, it's not done out of fascism, it's actually a thoughtful conversation that we've looked at different studies and we've said, hey, you know what, on this thing, we agree people should be treated with dignity, we agree you shouldn't be bullied, we agree you should make the choices you want to make. However, we just don't think this is ideal, and I don't think this should be taught in schools, and I don't think that, is it unreasonable to come to that conclusion?
I think it just depends on what conservative you're talking about. If you're talking about
I'm saying after this conversation with me, do you feel like I'm unreasonable for coming to this conclusion?
I don't think you're unreasonable, but I actually think you're really good faith, if I'm honest. I thought you were that on Twitter, even though I still think that there are tenets of fascism that parallel. That doesn't mean you're a fascist. But with gender,
so I'm not a fascist. You gave me that. You gave me that at the beginning, and you gave me that here. Okay, that's a step in the right direction.
But there we go. I think the thing to consider though is even though I do think you in particular are good faith, I do not think that the position as a whole normally comes from good faith. Just a couple things to note. While there is a tremendous amount of either attack at the worst, or at least criticism at best from more conservative-leaning individuals, this is anecdotal, but a very helpful statistic. There's a significant amount of people who watch adult entertainment that has trans women in it, particularly from that conservative ilk.
Oh, you're saying they're low key into it, and then they're just projecting that. Listen, I don't know anything. I've seen the data. I haven't looked at any data, but that's hilarious. And I do remember that being a thing with some of the anti-gay stuff, and then finding out a lot of those folks were on the down low, right? So that's fair. I guess where I'm getting at is how do we get to? Okay, let me ask you this way: do you think some of the attacking is in response to how much this is being pushed now as a mainline issue to represent a very small percentage of the population, right? So when a Matt Walsh, who I don't agree with everything on, makes a documentary like What is a Woman, right? Or whatever the documentary is called. I haven't even seen the documentary, I've just seen clips from it. And it's difficult to get people just to even answer the question like, what is a woman, right? And it's like, well, a woman is a woman, you know? Like, do you think that that is coming from a malicious place, or do you think that's coming from a response and what they feel like every time they turn on a new Disney movie, this stuff is being pushed. Every time they turn on the news, Fox News is now celebrating stuff, like that they feel attacked and they're responding to this. Because I don't really make content about this stuff. Like I don't make, you know, don't transition, like I don't make those types of videos, right? But what I'm saying is when I see it everywhere, it's natural for people to say, look, I don't agree with you, but if you're gonna call me a bigot and you gonna say I'm a fascist, like now I gotta clap back. And then you get a What is a Woman type of documentary, which actually highlighted a bunch of folks that detransitioned and really tried to get to the bottom of queer theory and gender theory, right? So my question to you is, do you think some of that is coming from a response of feeling attacked?
I guess there is a feeling of an attack, right? I don't want to completely invalidate that response as purely reactionary, but a lot of it is, unfortunately. And, you know, the idea of push, it just depends on how you define push, man. Like, I think there's a lot of people who are genuinely just like, look, there are people in our society who exist like this, so we're going to put them in the media. We're going to teach this stuff in schools because regardless of how we feel about the issue, there is I mean, because even let's, you know, like, I guess at one point the gay population was 2%. And if you factor in all of the LGBTQ plus community, I'm sure that's, you know, a higher percent, but it's not like it's like 20% or anything.
No,
like
it
that,
is.
right?
It is. It's 20%. Remember the graph I showed you earlier?
Oh, yeah.
Yes,
Okay,
it's 20% now.
well, but here we go though. So even if you take, you know, just the trans community of that 20%, like that's millions of people
Sure.
in a society, you know?
Sure.
And so the idea that they would be put in media, put in schools, that there would be gender ideology taught so that people can understand. The last thing you want is for, you know, kids or even like college students to get on a train, or even boomers to get on a train, see a trans person, have no idea any of the studies, never seen this stuff in media, anything, and just be reactionary to that person. That's why it's being put in all these spaces. And I think sometimes conservatives take it as, well, you're attacking our way of life or our worldview. And really, it's just, no, we're representing and communicating and educating on a group of people that, whether we like it or not, are in our society. And so how do we define pushed, you know, is an
let me give you an example. Let me give you a reasonable example, okay? And maybe you'll hate this example. I got a couple examples for you, but let me just give you the most reasonable one. Dave Chappelle, right? Dave Chappelle did that special. I listened to it in November. I felt uncomfortable. I mean, some of the stuff he said about pastors and priests and like, it was a lot. He unloaded the clip on everybody, right? And then he does some trans jokes. The community that was the most outraged was the trans community. It wasn't the Catholics. It wasn't the Christians. It wasn't anybody. I mean, he had a Martin Luther King oral sex joke in there. Like, it was bad, right? Like, it was really vulgar. But that community took that stuff and then said, and try to get him to lose his Netflix deal, right? And try to get him out of there, right? And protested him. And NPR wrote, and I'm not exaggerating, NPR wrote, and I quote, Dave Chappelle used white privilege.
I know.
In his attacking of the trans community. Now, let me give you another example, because I actually really want to hear what you think about that. Let me give you another example. My wife has a phobia of animals, and it's nuts. I'm talking, my mom brought her little chihuahua over, and my wife hopped up on our dinner table, okay? Like, it doesn't make sense. My kids want an animal, we're never getting an animal. It's that bad. It's like, she'll jump around. She hates cats, she hates dogs. She has a real phobia of animals. When someone is using language that Dave Chappelle is transphobic in culture, and he's telling you stories in multiple stand-ups of his trans friend, That's when I think most people will go in and say, wait a minute, because phobia is a really specific thing. Like, that's a very specific thing. And someone who's not even, like, I'm more conservative than Dave Chappelle on this, right? Or what's the J.K. Rowling, right? They're not even saying anything nuts. Like, they're just saying, in my opinion, very simple things. Dave Chappelle's cracking jokes, he's being funny. When these people then get pushed into a corner of saying, you're transphobic and you're one of those conservatives over there, right? It's that age-old meme where folks that were in the center are being pushed further and further and further to the right. I don't identify as a conservative, right? And I can tell you, this is an issue where I'm conservative on, but I could tell you 5 other things that I'm progressive on, like actually like progressive on, right? So I think that's where I go, fam, everyone that disagrees with you isn't a bigot and doesn't want to harm you. And like, if anything, I don't want to see anybody get harmed. And I'm a lot of times speaking up in Christian communities going, yo, Greg Cox, like, he's tripping, like, cut that out. You know what I'm saying? What's the pastor? Like, these, like, I'm actually defending, saying, y'all gotta chill. Like, this is not helpful, right? Bryson Gray confronts this conservative speaker and it makes a big spiel about it, right? Like, but when the narrative is Dave Chappelle's a bigot, he's transphobic, J.K. Rowling's a bigot, transphobic, anybody that, laughs at that's where I think people go, wait a minute, this is such an overcorrection. This is such an overreaction to every little thing that, in my opinion, this becomes fundamentalism inverted. This becomes, we were hurt by the fundamentalists from the 90s and the Websboro Baptists, so we're gonna take that exact same thinking and we're gonna say, if y'all don't rock with us, you're transphobic and you're racist and you're right. And it's like, wait a minute, where is the good faith conversation? Where is the conversation that ultimately we all wanna see our kids do better than us? Ultimately, we all wanna enjoy a quality of life where we could just be left alone, right? Where is that? And I think, I'm speaking for me, I'm not speaking for conservative, I'm speaking for me on this issue and why I always feel pushed further and further right. And I just, fam, like, look at my content from 2 years ago. Like, I am not a conservative, like, or at least I don't see myself as such, right? So anyway, I would love to hear your thoughts. I know I said a whole lot there, but I just think there's a mass difference between, like, I'm phobic of somebody, I have an issue with somebody, I dislike somebody, right? Versus saying, yeah, no, I'm just not on that, but I love you, I respect you, you could be in my life, we could be friends, we hang, and I have folks, relationships like this, like, all the time, right? So help me understand why is there this thing to, like, if you don't affirm, you hate me, right? If you don't affirm everything about me, you hate me, versus saying, hey, I don't affirm anything about everybody in my life. There's parts about my mom, her alcoholism, the way she speaks to my wife. I don't affirm that. I find it problematic, right? I rebuke that, right? So help me understand.
Yeah, so I think there's a couple of things there. One, there's a huge power distinction in the people that he used jokes for. Martin Luther King he's the greatest American of all time. He's got such a reputation that you taking a little joke at his, possible sexual misconduct or even exaggerating some of that in an oral sex joke is pretty harmless to his reputation. As much as Christians believe that they are kind of at a power deference in America, Christians, whether it's Catholic, Protestant, priest, have a significant amount of cultural influence, apparatus, and power in the American context. The reason the trans community responded the way they did was because when jokes like that get told, especially from a place of maybe ignorance, tropes, or stereotypes, that significantly hurts and damages their life. Just a couple quick examples. There are, beautiful trans women out there who a man, gets interested in them at a party, maybe even has like a intimate interaction with them. And then once they find out that person's trans, even though they had an intimate interaction, they're trans women who are being killed every day, particularly minority trans women, African American and Hispanic trans women.
Do you have those studies? Because I've never seen a study correlated. Okay, so there's two different things. I've never seen a study correlated saying if someone if jokes in society persist, this damages physically brings harm. I've never seen a study correlated for that. And then two, how many trans women? How often is this happening, right? And because I don't know. I genuinely don't know. So like, how are we talking? This happens 10 times a year. This happens 100 times a year. This happens 1,000 times a year. How many trans women are losing their lives in these sorts of situations?
Well, unfortunately, I don't have the data right in front of me. I mean, this is something that trans people have made society very aware of, is that they are that there is a significant amount of hate crimes against the trans community. How it correlates to jokes, I think that study is going to be pretty hard to like make that like exact correlation, but it may be better to see it in the idea of anytime that you have tropes, potential like mild propaganda against minority groups, you are going to intensify hate crimes. We saw that during Corona with, President Trump calling the coronavirus the Chinese virus or whatever, and the Wu virus or whatever, and look at the uptick in hate crimes against the Asian community during that time period. So you are going to see a correlation. Right.
There was 57 transgender or gender non-binary people fatally taken out in 2021, and there's been 14 in 2022.
That's a good thing.
Yeah, so the numbers are seemingly decreasing, right? The numbers are seemingly decreasing. So you stated an interesting example, which is like somebody meets somebody, and then does a man not have the right to say, I don't want to be with a trans woman if she didn't disclose that? They do have that right. Okay. It's just they don't have the right to impose violence. We would agree then.
100%.
Yeah. Okay. Got you. Okay. Because I wasn't sure if you were saying it was wrong. Like if a dude is at a party and he meets somebody and she fly and then finds out that she was biologically born a man, he's like, I'm not really into that. You know what I'm saying? Yeah. Okay. So we agree.
Yeah. Who you're attracted to is who you're attracted to. That's all Gucci, right? Yeah, I was using the example to say that is happening to a lot of trans women, and I'm actually happy to see that statistics going down. It maybe shows that we're becoming a more tolerant society. But I think the reason that Dave Chappelle got the pushback he did is because he did come against a community that, well, it's not that he just did it in a stand-up. It's that he's done it in a lot of stand-ups recently, and that he, even in some of his like interactions outside of stand-up, seems to keep bringing it up. J.K. Rowling, it feels like every other month, goes on a Twitter tirade, almost completely unprovoked, about the trans issue. And so I feel
like she reacts to situations. Like there was a situation in the UK where there was like a woman that was assaulted by a trans woman, and then they like didn't call it RAPE. Right? I feel like she kind of highlights some of those stories, which are like those things do happen. Again, I saw a lot of this stuff seems to be happening more in Europe, where this kind of weird imbalance of lesbian, trans violence and that whole dynamic, which I know nothing about, but I feel like she kind of highlights more of that stuff and less of just like, I'm just gonna pull up and unload the clip, like, and just dunk on a community.
She's definitely, and I mean, everyone's provoked from something, right? So it's not like she's just bringing it up out of thin air. She's provoked from something, but it feels unprovoked when it feels like this feels like a constantly targeted situation. And even if that is the thing that provoked her, well, physical violence is illegal. So it's already illegal. So the fact that a trans person, or maybe even unless it's becoming like an epidemic, the fact that a trans person attacked a cis woman that's not like news. It's really just an illegal thing where that person needs to be dealt with. And so I think with Dave Chappelle and J.K. Rowling, what's the problematic thing is they're two incredibly powerful, influential people who seem to be spending a lot of energy talking about the trans issue. And even though, like with J.K. Rowling in particular, she keeps citing studies, some of them tend to be pretty falsifiable. And also, she's never giving like the overwhelming consensus of the other studies that show the health of this situation and are kind of pro trans. It seems to be that she continues to find these fringe may be too strong of a word, but certainly not consensus studies, and that's what she keeps touting. And when you have these two very powerful people consistently kind of attacking, if you will, at least even if you say mildly, a minority group, that's going to have adverse effects on that minority group.
Yeah, I guess the measurement, I guess the barometer, right? 1.2 million trans folks in America, 14 fatally wounded, right, this year. I don't know. I don't know. One, can we tie that correlation between Dave Chappelle? Can we tie that correlation between J.K. Rowling? Or is there other variables involved to why these situations happen? I don't know. I think anybody being taken out for any reason regarding something that they identify as, whether it's orientation or whatever, I think is wrong, and I think it's foul, and I don't think that should be happening. So anyway, do you have any questions for me? Is there anything you want to ask me? Is there anything I need to clarify with regards to exactly where I'm at with this conversation?
Well, let me just, I do have a couple, but let me just say, man, huge honor you having me on the show. Good Religion is one of my favorite albums ever.
Let's go.
Like legit, bro. I was working at a church, but they paid for me to go to college about 5 years ago. And literally walking up and down campus, man, was still bumping that album. Loved your grind and your hustle with a lot of the singles you put out. Loving the media hustle right now and the grind. And so, yeah, even though, we had a mildly spicy conversation on Twitter, just know I followed your career loosely and have been a fan.
Man.
So yeah, thankful to have this conversation with you. I guess my questions for you would be one, so you look at Jesus with women in singleness, and you look at the agrarian society that he was in. And the idea of, one, telling women that they could be single, two, giving grace to sexual promiscuity, and three, commissioning women to ministry vocations when it was completely unutilitarian to do so, because women were functioning as procreators, nurturers of the home, and that was creating a very efficient society. And there were some adverse effects to potentially allowing women to have more what's the word I'm looking for? Why am I blanking on a word? But basically, it did rupture society a significant amount to have women entertaining more than kind of what was their rigid social gender role. And Jesus opened up that door tremendously against a lot of pushback. And so I'm just wondering, what does it look like for us as Christians in our modern society to pull away from gender rigidity and have more expansive or varied understandings of how gender can function? Because Jesus certainly did. I mean, it was mind-blowing that a woman could teach and learn, or mind-blowing that a woman could be forgiven for sexual promiscuity, especially when her sexual promiscuity could hurt land inheritance if there's dispute over whose father is this, or who's the kid really belonged to, or mind-blowing for women to even be single in that society. So he definitely challenged the gender norms of his time. How do Christians do that today, and how do you see that in particular?
Yeah, that's a great question. So the question is, so the presupposition is that Jesus challenged what was normative of women in that society, which I would agree with. I think Jesus, I mean, I don't know anyone else that did more for women in terms of, you know, besides Jesus. And I would also say Proverbs chapter 31, there's the, you know, the wife in Proverbs chapter 31, that whole bit, right? So I would agree. Yeah, Jesus, you know, why do we need feminism when you could just look at Jesus? Like, it's right there, you know? So I would agree with you. I would say, how do we do that today? I think there's a variety of ways we can do that today. One, I think it's encouraging and empowering women and giving them permission to do what it is that they feel comfortable doing in the season that's optimal for them, right? So like, I don't want to jump around too much, but if we go back to the idea of wealth inequality, right? Which is, I think, it could be an issue, right? What you also find out is that wealth inequality is oftentimes more spread out across age, that it's more connected to age than it is to any other variable, meaning that men tend to make the peak of their income in their 40s. And that's just historically how it's always been. And so we're seeing a lot of folks that are in their 20s and they're mad at folks in their 40s and 50s. Well, it's like, fam, when you get older, you develop more skills, your network expands, you become more useful. In a different season of life, we all tend to make more money as our career moves along. And I would say it's the same thing for anything else in life. I would say that I'm personally not a fan of dudes at 28, 29, 30 years old planting churches. I think that's stupid. I think you need to wait and be in a different season of life where you know you got some life under you, you can lead, so on and so forth. And so I think it's all about seasons for me, right? Like I think women can do whatever they want to do. I think they can go get educated. I think they can start businesses. I think they can work it outside the home. I think the question is, when is the optimal season to do such things? And I think sometimes we're always trying to produce fruit from a future season and make it the now. And whenever you're trying to get fruit from a season that's out of season, it always costs you more, right? Like if it's not, I'm in Southern California, so we have a wide variety, but like, fam, if you want avocados in December, they're gonna cost you four times more than avocados in the summertime. You know what I mean? Or watermelon, like whatever the thing is, like I love fruit. So I think when we're trying to pull fruit from a future season, income, flexibility with schedule, children, so on and so forth, I think that's when we get into trouble. And so I think there is something to saying, yeah, like, women having kids in their 20s is optimal to how their bodies are designed to function, to how all these different things. So why are we projecting on women that you need to have a bad body, you need to have a bad career, and you need to have a bad husband, and you gotta have kids? Like, whoa, that's a whole lot to be projecting on people, instead of saying, hey, what's the optimal season that you're in, and how do we create that? And so I know a lot of women entrepreneurs. I know a lot of women in ministry. You know what I mean? But they tend to be older. They tend to be in a season where their kids are out of school, right? And I know a lot of men that work hard, but not when they have little kids. Like, I got a 1-year-old. I'm not doing the Gary V work your face off for 80 hours a week and don't sleep. That's stupid, right? Like, hustle culture in that season is stupid. But if my nephew's around here and he's here with me for the summertime and he's 18, he's about to be a senior in high school, I'm like, fam, learn to get paid for your results and not for your time. This is the season while you sitting here on FaceTime with your little girlfriend. Open up this Final Cut and I'll pay you to edit these videos if you could develop that skill set. And I don't care if it takes you 10 minutes to edit a video or, you know, an hour to edit a video. It doesn't matter. You're going to get paid for your results, not for your time. He's in a different season where if he balances it out, he can take advantage and work harder, work longer than me, who's 37 with a 1-year-old, a 7-year-old, a 6-year-old niece. You know what I mean? So I think it goes back to just like what's optimal for flourishing. And I don't think we like to acknowledge that part. I don't think we like to acknowledge that you make more money later on in life, that it's optimal to have children for women's bodies earlier in their 20s, early 30s. And so we've done all this like modern cosmopolitan nonsense, but we don't seem to be any more happier. Like, we don't seem to, like, we've done all the affirming, all the all the postmodernism, and society doesn't seem to be more happy. It doesn't seem to be, right? And so I don't know if we could just blame capitalism for all of our ills. I think we have to take a look inward and say, man, maybe there's some things to like how our grandparents lived. Maybe there was some wisdom there, you know, and so that's kind of what I would say to women is like, yeah, I think they could do a variety of things, but I think empowering them and creating opportunity for them to do the things that they're probably like. What's the desire, but what's the deeper desire, right? Like my wife is now in a season where she's starting to work outside the home again. She's working at the church a couple hours. She's doing a little freelance stuff. Praise God, she's in her mid-30s. She has useful skills that she's acquired. She's been able to raise our kids, and it's a great season for her. Maybe 10 years from now, she'll be back to teaching. I don't know what she's going to be doing, right? So that's how I would look at it. I know that's not like a great, like, politically correct, neat answer, but I would just say it would just depend. I would just say it would depend, and I think we need to encourage and empower women more, in my opinion, to, like, don't feel like you got to go get the law degree and then stop your entire career to have kids at 35 because the clock is ticking. Like, I don't know how that's helpful and beneficial to flourishing, in my opinion.
Gosh, it's so funny because you were like, we can't blame everything on capitalism. And like, I was just sitting here and like 3 or 4 things that you said, I was like, yeah, that's because of capitalism.
Yeah, I think me and you are going to fundamentally disagree on anything related there. And by the way, when I say capitalism, like, I am not talking about like corporatism. I'm not talking crony capitalism. I'm not co-signing what we have here now, where the government is stepping in and bailing us out and manipulating interest rates and giving airlines billions of dollars and sending people like that's not. I am not talking about that, because a lot of times when the government intervenes, the money's going to go to the wealthy anyway. That's usually how these things flow. It's just going to flow up, right? So that's not what I'm. So just don't. When I say capitalism, do not think that I'm endorsing the way the system is set up here, because I think it's very problematic. I'm talking about, when I say capitalism, I'm talking about a free market. You own your labor. You own what you produce. You own what you create. You own land. You own property. Right, that's what I mean by that, which I think that predates America, that predates everywhere. If you go and study Ethiopian, the Orthodox Church in Ethiopia, Armenia, all these places that predate our modern civilizations and Alan Smith and all that, I think have an example of property rights, of owning your labor, so on and so forth, that I think are congruent with what a free market society is, right? That's what I mean by capitalism. I'm not talking about what we have here currently. There's a lot of issues with our system today.
Yeah, 100%. Man, if we ever get to talk again, if you want to talk capitalism versus socialism, I'm so down. I'm so down.
Yeah, I mean, we might have to. We might have to. Go ahead.
I'd be down, man. I guess my last question for you is, you know, so I guess I get the tendency from your Twitter and a lot of your media stuff is that you are, would you consider yourself labels are rough, a moderate?
A moderate?
Yeah.
Politically? We're talking politics right now?
Yeah.
Okay.
Or even ideologically, politically, yeah.
I think it would depend on the issue. I think I would depend on the issue. Like, I'm definitely not rocking with Biden and this current administration. I think there's been a lot of fumbles. In 2019, I liked some of the Andrew Yang UBI ideas. I think there's some really interesting stuff there that could clean up a lot of both sides of the equation with the idea of UBI. So I like that. I met Andrew Yang personally. My views sort of shifted. I'm definitely not a Trump guy. I'm as far away as I can be from Trump. I'm registered as an independent. You know what I'm saying? I would not vote for Trump again. You know, I didn't vote for Biden either. You know, so politically, I probably would lean more into like a libertarian position, with the caveat that I am pro-life. But I think depending on the issue, right? If we're talking healthcare, like, I think we need to make some progress on healthcare. I think I would be a progressive with regards to healthcare. I don't know if that means I'm for a one-party universal healthcare system. I don't know about that, right? But I think there needs to be some cleanup of how drug prices are, of how like the markups in some of these things are. And then there's other issues that I'm like, no, I think we need to leave this alone. You know what I mean? Like, I don't think we need to make women's sports more progressive. I think we need to leave that alone. I'm a progressive in an area like that. So I think it would just depend on the issue. People usually will call me center left or center right. They're like, oh, you're kind of center left or you're center right. That's usually what like other people refer to me as. So I just think it would really depend. I definitely believe There's systemic issues that we need to fix, right? I definitely believe that consequences from yesterday impact decisions in groups and marginalized communities today. I think how we fix those things, I'm gonna say, yeah, I really like the government. Like, I think there's a time and a place for it, but let's educate people on how to thrive within the system. And I don't really know how to fix government bailouts that mess up the economy. I don't know how to fix any of that stuff. But I know that if we could teach people how to be frugal, if we could teach people how to make better decisions, how to stay out of debt, how to make, delay gratification, I think generally speaking, people are going to be better off if we can teach them those life skills. And everybody's not going to start at the same place, and we're all going to mess up, and it's not fair. But neither is equality. Equality is not fair, and what we have now is not fair. But what are we going to do with the hands that we got dealt? How are we going to make it? What do we got to, you know what I mean? And I think that comes to me, and this might be crazy, but I think that comes down to a person-to-person situation, that let me help the people in my network. Let me pull my brothers up. Let me get other Christian YouTubers and promote them. So it's not just all about me. Let me spread out the resource I have, not because I believe capitalism is bad. No, because like I choose to be generous and I choose to help, right? And I think that to me is way more of like something we could all strive for, and less like I got to depend on whoever, wherever, who's ran by lobbyists anyway, who got paid to be in that position anyway to do any type of real change. I just don't see it happening in that regard, And so I don't know. That's probably not a great answer, but yeah. So it would just depend on the issue.
I feel, yeah, and I was kind of like setting that up to ask, like, I notice a lot of kind of center right, center left commentators. I guess people would say that Joe Rogan was there. I don't know if he was ever really there. I think he was always a little bit more right. That's a matter of interpretation, right? But like,
hold on, real quick. Like Joe Rogan is like pro-choice. Joe Rogan,
he's got
like
he's got a couple issues,
but he endorsed Bernie Sanders.
Trump was pro-choice, but
correct,
yeah,
yes, but he endorsed Bernie Sanders, which is like a progressive. He promoted Andrew Yang heavy, which is like UBI. I think Rogan is one of those guys that got pushed into the right, and all of a sudden it was really
That's exactly what I'm about to ask.
Yeah. Go ahead.
That's exactly what I'm about to ask. How do you avoid, like, I see a lot of people get pushed into the right, and if I look at the state of the right now, not like right-wing ideology, I guess you would say that you hold to a more, at times on certain issues, traditionalist, not everything, but a traditionalist right-wing ideology on some things. But when you look at the actual party platform, like they're a mess right now. Like they're like pretty ugly, and I have a lot of residue from the Trump era. Like, how do you yourself, and this isn't super pointed, it's literally curiosity, how do you yourself not become more and more reactionary? Because it seems like you feel like the left is pushing. I don't know that I agree with that interpretation, but how do you yourself not become more kind of reactionary in a lot of these conversations?
By having conversations like this, by wanting to like not straw man your position and actually listen and say, man, me and Joshua disagree on a lot. But I don't think he's being malicious, and I don't think he's trying to hurt kids, and I don't think he's trying to be combative. And I think a lot of times, and listening to debates, honestly, like listening to debates, like if you sit down, I would recommend this for everybody, like sit down and listen to, I always butcher his name, but I think it's Jink from the Young Turks. Yeah, like listen to him on Valuetainment. Listen to him and Ben Shapiro debate. And what you'll discover is when you hear somebody really, really right, like a Ben Shapiro or Patrick Bet-David, and someone like him debate, you'll discover that there's actually way more overlap in the issues that they're seeing in society. It's how do we fix things? Like how do, the solutions are just different. It's the same issues, we just, how do we fix things are different, right? So it's like, you look at an issue like public schools, right? And we'd be like, man, yo, public schools are trash, especially public schools in black neighborhoods. Property taxes are funding these public schools. That's not right. We should help public schools do better, right? And then depending on if you're conservative or if you're a liberals are gonna be like, yeah, we need to increase funding for public schools. And then the conservatives be like, we need to do school vouchers, right? Totally different approaches, both trying to fix an issue, right? Now, there are bad faith actors, I believe, in all spectrums of political community. And I do believe there are bad faith actors in the conservative and, community. But I think there's a mess on the left as well. So I think, honestly, brother, like conversations like this, like just having a conversation with you and being like, man, we aren't as off as we are in our heart and in our assessment. However, we just have some different solutions in terms of how we would prescribe these things. I think your heart in saying like, man, we don't want trans people brutalized. We don't want them hurt. We don't want them, we don't want them taken out. And I would be like, yeah, and I'm gonna say that. And by the way, and all of my conservative friends would agree with you. They'd be like, yeah, like folk like Zuby and Patrick Bet-David, and right, they'd all be like, yeah, like that's awful. You know what I mean? Like we don't want anybody hurt. So I think that's how we do it, man. And just having a good faith conversation. And again, I'm trying to learn as well. Like I want to learn from you to understand what you actually believe, and then you asking me these questions is helpful to me because I'm like, yeah, I got to be intentional with how I craft my Twitter so that I don't become like what you're describing, where I'm just this reactionary guy. You know what I mean? But yeah, and if I'm honest with you though, I do think things are shifting right. Like I do think there's something in the air and things are moving more aligned in that direction, where like a lot of the independent media seems to be moving that way. Folks on the progressive side are talking to, conservatives more and more. And I do think things are shifting that way. I guess we'll just have to see the midterms and how it goes. But I think they're fumbling, bro. Like I think the left is fumbling bad. I think the identity politics. I'll give you one example. Maybe you disagree and push back. I followed the primaries very carefully because I was in California. And I remember Kamala Harris getting whooped in all the polls. I'm talking about, there was a California poll that had Andrew Yang winning in California against Kamala Harris, who is the district attorney. Go back and look at the Breakfast Club comment section for both of the Kamala Harris interviews. And you'll just see utter disdain for people from California from her, because we remember the nonsense that she did when she was district attorney here, right? Like so to see the left take her and be like, black woman, vice president, is like, fam, this is where intersectionality and the idea of like, we need to just platform people based on their identity, I think is gonna take a massive L. And I saw that, like I literally watched I watched every debate. I saw her just get owned and destroyed in all the polls. And then to see her become the vice president as just a bad politician, she's literally the worst polling vice president in history, I think, is why the left, and she gonna run against Trump? She's gonna run against DeSantis? Like, it's gonna be bad, bro. Like it's gonna be bad. And so I think the identity politics, I just don't think it's a good look. I think we could talk issues, and I think they need some fresh, but I think AOC is awful. And I think they need some fresh blood. I think they need some like conservative Democrats in the mix who are going to step up and, I don't know. But I'm just flowing with you right now. I don't know like that. You know what I mean? But that's my when I saw that happen, I was like, this is bad. Like this is really, really, really bad for the Democrats.
I feel that. And just know, like, and like I said, man, we got to get back together for that whole left-right socialism, free market conversation. But like just know that, like, as someone who's like genuinely on the left, like, we don't like we're farther left than Kamala. We don't like Kamala, and we don't get into identity politics. I mean, we definitely care about
See,
civil rights.
I didn't know that. Like, I didn't know that.
Right.
You know what I mean?
Yeah, I'm a part of why Kamala isn't polling well. You know what I'm saying?
But bro, there was better options. That's the frustrating part. There were better options.
Better.
You know what I mean? Like I was rocking with Andrew Yang. People think Tulsi Gabbard is flipped, but back then she hadn't. Like I thought Tulsi Gabbard was like military vet, moderate. You know what I mean? Like I thought there were so many better options that I just felt like they just fumbled, man, and they got Biden in there, and like I don't think he's doing well. But brother, thank you so much. I do want to get you on again, maybe do a longer form conversation on capitalism versus socialism. I think that'll be fun. You're in Dallas, right?
I'm in Dallas, bro. Yeah.
Right. And you have a podcast as well. Can you tell everybody about your podcast and where they could check you out at?
Absolutely, man. I'm on the Moral Minority Show, or the Moral Minority, I think is the way that it's put in the platforms. And yeah, basically it's just hopefully minority perspective, me and my buddy Joel, on Christian culture, politics, art, kind of whatever we decide to talk about. We talk about hip hop a little bit too. And so, yeah, man, y'all check that out. It's good. We got a website. We got some articles up also for some information and just healthy content. And so, yeah, we just want to give a kind of a fresh minority perspective on kind of a variety of issues.
Guys, if you enjoyed this conversation, let me know in the comment section. What'd you think? Do you want to see more conversations like this? And if you want to see another conversation that I had, one of my favorite videos I've ever made that I feel like I slept on, check out the time I talked to an ex-NFL football player, Jeremy Davis, about him transitioning from being a football player and losing it all and starting over. That will be linked over there. All right, I'll see you later. Peace.